Hello everyone, this is Dr. Pritpal Singh, an MD Pharmacology from CMC Ludhiana, and I welcome you back to the session on the drugs acting on the autonomic nervous system. In the last session, we had started with the uh, the UGC curriculum competency as per NMC 1.13 and 1.14, where we were talking about the mechanism of action, the types, the uses, the adverse effects, the contraindication, and the indications of cholinergic and anticholinergic drugs, as well as adrenergic and anti-adrenergic drugs, which come under the competency of pH 1.13 and 1.14. So we will be talking about the competency pH 1.14, where we will be talking about one particular aspect of a group of drugs, that is the cholinergic drugs. And just a brief recap of what I did in the previous session. In the previous sessions, I was started with the basic division of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. I talked about the importance of the post ganglionic neurotransmitter, which either involves acetylcholine or adrenaline, forming the basis of either adrenergic or the cholinergic system of classification of drugs. And further, I talked about the length of the preganglionic and the ganglionic chain, as well as the location of the ganglions and the postganglionic neurons that forms the basis of division of sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is mainly for the flight and fright, whereas parasympathetic is for rest and repose. So we start with the parasympathetic or the cholinergic system, or the drugs that mechanism of action of the various drugs that act on the cholinergic system, and we'll be talking about this particular group of drugs. So we start with the drugs of cholinergic system, which are labeled as drugs that tend to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, or drugs that mimic the action of acetylcholine. So any drug that stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system or stimulates the action of acetylcholine is parasympathomimetic or cholinomimetic drug. Now, how is this acetylcholine formed in the prejunctional neurons? In the prejunctional neuron, acetate along with ATP and coenzyme A forms acetyl coenzyme A with the help of the enzyme acetyltransferase. And this particular enzyme, along with choline, leads to formation of acetylcholine. Now, this acetylcholine is taken up in the vesicles, where it is stored out there until an impulse is generated, and this particular impulse then leads to emptying of these vesicles into the synaptic junction. Release of acetylcholine is there. This acetylcholine, once it acts on the post-junctional receptors, it tends to break down with the help of an enzyme cholinesterase into acetate and choline. Choline is taken back, which is further acted upon by acetyl coenzyme A to form acetylcholine. This cycle continues so that we have a sufficient amount of acetylcholine present in the synaptic vesicles. Now, the cholinergic receptors, or the drugs, or the receptors where acetylcholine binds, are classified into muscarinic receptors and the nicotinic receptors. Now, these are both the receptors that are activated by acetylcholine, and they are named because nicotinic receptors are activated by nicotine, and muscarinic receptors are activated by muscarine. Now, when we talk about the type of receptors that they are, the muscarinic receptors are G protein coupled receptors, whereas the nicotinic receptors are the ligand-gated ion channels. G protein coupled receptors leads to either activation of adenyl cyclase, or they also lead to activation of phospholipase C. Whereas when we talk about the ligand-gated ion channels, there's opening of ion channels in the presence of acetylcholine, further leading to either influx of sodium ion, leading to generation of action potential. Now, these muscarinic receptors are further subdivided into 5 types, that is M1, M2, M3, M4, and 5, whereas M4, the exact exact function of M4 and M5 is not known, but they are located in the CNS, whereas M1 is located in the CNS and autonomic ganglion, M2 is present in the heart, M3 in the gut, and the nicotinic receptors are further subdivided into NM and NN, where M stands for present in the neuromuscular junction, whereas NM stands for present in the autonomic ganglion, adrenal medulla, or CNS. So the agonist for muscarinic receptor is muscarine, whereas the antagonist is the atropine. Similarly, the agonist for nicotinic receptor is nicotine, and the antagonist is curare. Now, further talking about this, now these are either excitatory, muscarinic receptors are either excitatory receptors or inhibitory receptors. So the odd ones, that is M1, M3, and M5 are excitatory receptors, whereas M2 and M4 are inhibitory receptors. So that means that these muscarinic receptors are G protein coupled receptors, and they are either GQ type or GI type. So M1, M3, and M5 are GQ type, that is, they tend to have the IP3 inositol triphosphate and diacylglycerol are the transducer system, whereas the M2 and M4 are GI, that is, they inhibit the enzyme adenyl cyclase. M1 is present in the autonomic ganglion, in the CNS and the gastric gland. Major function is it tends to cause release of histamine and also leads to acid production. Whereas M3 receptors are excitatory, they are present in the exocrine gland and the visceral smooth muscles. In the exocrine glands, they lead to increased secretions, whereas in the visceral smooth muscle, they cause contraction of the smooth muscles. And in vascular endothelium, there's release of nitric oxide, which leads to vasodilatation. The M2 receptors are inhibitory receptors. They are present in the heart, and these receptors, they act on the SA node, AV node, atria, and ventricles. In the SA node, they cause a decrease in heart rate. In the atrioventricular node, they cause a decrease in velocity of conduction. In the atria, they cause shortening of action potential duration and effective refractory periods and decrease contraction, whereas in the ventricle, they tend to decrease contraction. The nicotinic receptors are further categorized into NM type and NN type. These are ligand-gated receptors. NM type is present in the neuromuscular junction, causing contraction of the skeletal muscles, whereas NN type is present in the autonomic ganglion, adrenal medulla, CNS, causing release of catecholamines. Now, the cholinomimetic drugs could be drugs that could be direct acting. They could be either drugs like acetylcholine or alkaloids, or they could be indirect acting drugs that tend to inhibit the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is responsible for the breakdown of acetylcholine. So direct acting drugs could further be categorized into choline esters and alkaloids, whereas indirect acting could be cholinesterase inhibitors, which are carbamates and phosphates. Now, the examples of certain drugs that come under choline esters are acetylcholine, methancol, carbachol, and methacholine, whereas drugs that come under alkaloids are muscarine, pilocarpine, and ericoline. Now, talking about the pharmacological action of acetylcholine, so the pharmacological of acetylcholine can be divided into its action on the muscarinic receptors and on the nicotinic receptors. In the muscarinic receptors in the heart, there is present of M2 type of receptors, which are inhibitory, which lead to a fall in heart rate, a decrease in AV conduction, AV node conduction. Whereas when we talk about its action on the blood vessels, if we talk about the nitric oxide related vasodilatation, causing decrease in the blood pressure. Similarly, its action on the M3 receptor in the smooth muscles is related to the M3 receptors. They are present in the GIT and the urinary bladder, where they tend to cause contraction and lead to increase in tone and peristalsis. And in the urinary bladder, they tend to cause relaxation of sphincter. Whereas when we talk about the glands, again, the M3 type of receptors are present, which tend to increase the secretion. And in the eye, it leads to meiosis. Now, its action on the acetylcholine nicotinic receptors is that in the autonomic ganglion, it causes stimulation, contraction of the neuromuscular junction, and release of adrenaline. Where do we use choline esters? Choline esters are rarely used. Acetylcholine, because it is evanescent and non-selective, so it is hardly used. Methanicol has some oral applications, but not the drug of choice. It is used for either post-operative or postpartum non-obstructive urinary retention or neurogenic bladder atony or congenital megacolon, as well as in certain gastroesophageal reflux. Pilocarpine is a drug that is an alkaloid that is used for glaucoma. It is available as an eye drop. It tends to reduce the intraocular pressure. It tends to contract the effect of mydriasis, and it tends to prevent formation of adhesions between iris and lens or iris and cornea. And muscarine is not used because it has its toxicological significance. The other group of drugs are the indirect inhibitors, which are majorly used. Now, these indirect inhibitors are anticholinesterase, or better to be strict to the term acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Now, what are these acetylcholinesterase inhibitors? These acetylcholinesterase inhibitors are either reversible or irreversible, further categorized into carbamates and acridine. When we talk about reversible cholinesterase inhibitors, or if we are talking about irreversible inhibitors, we talk about organophosphates and carbamates. So the various carbamates are physostigmine, neostigmine, pyridostigmine, hydrophonium, rivastigmine, and donepezil. Whereas in acridine we have tacrine. Similarly, for organophosphates in irreversible we have diaflos, ectophyphate, malathion, parathion, diazinon, tabun, serine, suman. These are chemical gases, and we have carbamates, carbaryl, and propoxone. Why do we need to talk about these? Because this is one group of compounds that is readily available. It is one of the most common used insecticides that is available for us. So to sum up what I have told you in this session is that we have two group of drugs that act as cholinergic drugs. One is a direct acting, the other is an indirect acting. Direct acting is further subdivided into esters, and indirect is esters and alkaloids, whereas indirect is further subdivided into reversible or irreversible, such as carbamates and organophosphates. Now, these particular drugs, they act on two set of receptors. One is the muscarinic receptor, the other is the nicotinic receptor. Muscarinic receptors are of further 5 types or in 2 sets. One is excitatory, which is M1, 3, and M5, which act on the GQ system, and M2 and M4 are inhibitory, which act on the GI system. And the nicotinic receptors that are further categorized into NN and NM type. NM is present in the neuromuscular junction, whereas NN is present in the autonomic ganglion. And then we talked about the pharmacological actions of these drugs. So I'll stop my session out here. And if you have any questions or queries, do let me know. Write it down on the chat box, and I'll be happy to get back to you. I hope I had been able to clear some air on this particular topic. Happy learning and have a great day ahead. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.